Victoria C. Woodhull, nominated for the presidency. Who next? The following ridiculous scene is reported to have occurred at the women's suffrage meeting in East New York last Friday. Judge Carter of Ohio said the banner of equal rights now requires a standard bearer. He knew of no one who was so well entitled to the honor as Victoria C. Woodhull, who had so nobly championed their cause. He therefore moved that Victoria C. Woodhull be nominated by acclamation for the presidency of the United States. Woodhull thanked the meeting for the honor they had conferred upon her and closed by promising to merit their confidence. Moses Hull congratulated the meeting upon their selection and nominated that true friend of human liberty, Frederick Douglass, for the vice presidency. Another indignant auditor, who appeared intensely disgusted at the turn affairs had taken, shouted, "I move we nominate Spotted Tail for vice president, as the Indians had possession of this country before the Negroes." Shrieks of laughter followed. Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And that account that I've just read, that comes from a Pennsylvania newspaper from the 15th of May, 1872, describing the ridiculous scene of a new political party in America, the Equal Rights Party, nominating a woman for the presidency and a black activist, Frederick Douglass, for the vice presidency.
So this is the first of two episodes telling this forgotten story, the story of the first woman to run for president in the United States. It was not Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Which is what most people, I think, would say.
Which is, I think, what most people assume. And even if they know some of the earlier women who did, in fact, run for president, I think almost nobody knows that anybody ran as early as Victoria Woodhull in 1872. And it's interesting that even when Kamala Harris, when she took the nomination in 2024, she read out a roll call of her women forebears, the women who had been the trailblazers, who had broken the ground. And she didn't invoke Victoria Woodhull either. She's been completely forgotten. I'm betting most of our listeners have never even heard of her.
Well, I have to admit, I hadn't heard of her until you told me about her.
She's been erased, but she deserves to be more than a footnote in American history.
She does, because even if she hadn't run for president, her story is quite incredible.
Right? She wasn't only the first woman to run for president, although I love the title that she adopted. She called herself the future presidentess.
Presidentess.
Presidentess. She had a card printed with the future presidentess and signed it with this big flourish. But yeah, she wasn't just the first woman to run for president, as if that weren't, reason enough for history to remember her. She was also the first woman to address Congress, the first woman to open a brokerage on Wall Street, one of the first women to make a fortune on Wall Street. She was among the first women in America to become a publisher, and she was the first to publish Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto in English in America. I mean, it's a huge list of accomplishments. And as you say, even historians haven't heard of her.
Absolutely. But this is not a simple story of somebody who automatically should be given that stamp of hero. It's a much more complicated, much more contradictory story.
Absolutely. There are contradictions in that list of accomplishments I just read, right? She made a fortune trading on Wall Street, and then she published Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, passionately advocating the overthrow of the capitalist order that had enriched her, right? So yeah, it's a story full of contradictions. We're going to have to get used to them. So in today's episode, we'll tell the story of her meteoric rise and her entry into New York's corridors of power. And we'll end with her announcing her ambition to run for president of the United States. And the next time, we'll pick up the story of that run for president under the Equal Rights Party and the consequences of her explosive decision.
And this is a story that's going to take us into multiple aspects of American history in that period, before, during, and after the Civil War, into the Gilded Age. It's going to encounter lots and lots of kind of fractious moments in the story of America.
For all of her contradictions, she's a really representative figure in a lot of ways, and she pulls out a lot of what was happening in America at this time. But it's just really worth noting, we mentioned those accomplishments, but just thinking about what they actually mean. The fact that this woman pushed her way into the conversation around the American presidency, she pushed her way into the literal corridors of Congress, and it was 50 years before American women even had the vote. She marched onto Wall Street, right, the temple of American capitalism, when women couldn't legally open a bank account without a husband's permission. She was the first woman to own and publish a newspaper that not only advocated for women's suffrage, but it called for the abolition of marriage laws, the sexual liberation of women, labor rights, socialism, an end to corporate corruption. It's an extraordinary career for anyone. But Victoria Woodhull was a divorced, working-class woman with almost no formal education, a checkered past as a spiritualist, and an unapologetic belief in the right of women to love whom they pleased and to leave them when they stopped pleasing.
And she'd started life pretty close to the bottom of American society.
She did. She is really a rags to riches story. She's a rags to riches story, in fact. But it's really, I think, important to recognize for all of the contradictions in her story, which we're going to have to come back to again and again, the ideas that she was advocating truly were ahead of her time. She was one of the first women in America to understand that the barriers to women's equality were not only political, but economic and sexual. And that was a point made by one of her key biographers. And I think it's a really important one to bear in mind. She understood that the barriers were structural. It wasn't just about getting the vote.
And she used fame. She used, in some ways, infamy as a way of kind of short-circuiting the limits on what women could do. She's not shy about using publicity, building publicity to get what she wants.
Yeah, she wasn't not only not shy, she weaponized it, right? She was an early celebrity and she understood how celebrity could work for her. She maybe understood less well how celebrity might work against her, which is also part of what happened.
And her story is going to take us into a part of American history that has so many echoes with our own, the Gilded Age. And in a lot of ways, the Gilded Age feels very like the early 21st century.
In too many ways, right? So exactly. And we'll be getting into that as we tell this story. But I think Woodhull really kind of embodied the contradictory chaos of Gilded Age America, which is a time of rising monopoly capitalism, of growing labor unrest, of radical reformist thinking, of religious rebellion, sexual politics. It's all in the mix. And she's right at the heart of all of that.
This is an age of extremes of wealth and poverty, the age of the robber barons, of monopolies, of Rockefeller and the Vanderbilts and these millionaires.
Lots of our listeners will remember the phrase the 1% and the 99%, which was the slogan of the Occupy movement, 15, 20 years ago. But the first time that people started talking about the wealth gap in terms of the 1% and the 99% was actually Gilded Age America.
And that's where we're headed.
That's where we're going. And it was a time in which all of this chaos meant that there were lots of opportunities, but it was also a conservative age where there was enormous backlash against people like Victoria Woodhull. Her enemies called her literally Mrs. Satan. They called her a witch, a prostitute, of course. They called her a blackmailer, which she might have been. We'll have to get into that. A fraud. They called her a disease. Victoria Woodhull called herself something different. And I really love this quotation from her. She became famous for advocating what was called free love. And we're going to talk about that. But she turned that phrase on its head. And she made a speech where she said, "Brothers and sisters, so after all, I am a very promiscuous free lover. I want the love of you all promiscuously. It makes no difference who or what you are, old or young, black or white, pagan, Jew, or Christian. I want to love you all and be loved by you all. And I mean to have your love. If you will not give it to me now, these young, for whom I plead, will in after years bless Victoria Woodhull for daring to speak for their salvation."
Now that sounds like it was a speech given by a hippie in San Francisco in about 1964.
Doesn't it? And I think it's so ahead of its time, right? To remember to say it in the 1870s, old or young, black or white, pagan, Jew or Christian, this sense of inclusivity. She sees the array of humanity. But if
1870s, not 1970s.
No, exactly. A century ahead of her time. And yet it's the end of that speech that gets me, right? It's a knife in the heart, honestly, because when she recognizes that she's in the midst of this backlash and she's like, yeah, but the young will remember me. Posterity, you will all see what I've done. But the future generations that she thought were going to thank her, they never even learned her name. We haven't even learned her name because the establishment saw to that. I assumed she would have been shut down by the patriarchal establishment. That was what I thought when I first encountered her story. But it was also the feminist establishment. It was the women that she threatened as well. They sealed her fate. They scrubbed her from the story they wanted to tell about what they thought women's progress should look like. They didn't think that women's progress should look like Victoria Woodhull.
I mean, there is no question that this is a remarkable person who does some remarkable things, who is a pioneer in all sorts of ways. But this is also a troubling story about somebody who in the latter stage of their life has some really disturbing views.
Absolutely. And we will need to think about all of that because Victoria Woodhull's complexity is such that one way of thinking about the reason why she's been forgotten is that she didn't fit into any of the neat categories that were laid out for her.
Yeah, we want history to be heroes or villains.
Exactly.
We don't want heroes to have disturbing aspects to them. And this is absolutely not someone you can say she's all good or all bad.
100%. And so we're looking at someone who wasn't just silenced by the system. The system kind of found her unthinkable. And we have to think through Victoria Woodhull.
And specifically, those disturbing ideas in the latter stages of her life was one of the most popular pseudosciences of her age, the pseudoscience of eugenics. And she is an advocate. She is a vocal advocate for eugenics and the worst sorts of eugenics.
We said she was a representative figure in some ways, and that's one of the ways in which she is typical of her period. She's not entirely, atypical as well. But to properly understand the remarkable life of Victoria Woodhull, and it was a remarkable life by any standard, we of course have to go to the beginning and to see the really inauspicious start. You would not think that someone of her origins was going to end up having the life that she had.
Yeah, she starts at a time and a place where there's almost no chance that she's going to get anywhere.
It's a miracle, really. I mean, she is just one of those extraordinary individuals who rises above all circumstance, and you cannot believe that they achieved what they achieved. She was born Victoria, California, Claflin. A lot of her siblings were named for states, as a matter of fact. She's a sister named Tennessee. It was a family thing. I don't know.
It wasn't a fashion in America at the time.
It wasn't particularly a fashion at the time.
It's a family thing.
It was a family thing. She had an eccentric family, as we're about to hear. And it seems like one of their things was naming some of their kids after states. So they did, but they named her Victoria because of Queen Victoria, who was, of course, queen at the time. And Victoria herself always said that she felt that the name meant that she was destined for greatness. So she saw it as nominative determinism, whether anybody else did. She was born September 23rd, 1838. In Homer, Ohio. Now, we need to remember that Ohio in 1838 is very unsettled. This is the frontier, effectively. She's certainly in a backwoods town. She was the seventh of 10 children, and her family combined faith healing, grifting, really, and just kind of chaos in equal measure. Her father was a one-eyed con artist. He was a habitual fraudster. He was suspected locally of having burnt down his own grist mill for the insurance money, although he always said he didn't even bother to insure it. So who knows? It gives you a kind of sense of what this guy was like. He had to skip town after that incident when she was still a small child. But in, again, I think a very telling detail, he had had a brief stint running the local post office, and he left behind a pile of undelivered mail that he had slitted open and stripped of cash before he fled down. And then the family went. I think they all would have been better off if they hadn't gone to rejoin him, but the family went to rejoin him, and that set a pattern. They would move to a new town. He would do something stupid, or dodgy or whatever.
One of her biographers described it as a new town, a new identity, a new job, and a new baby.
And a new baby, exactly.
With each one of these crises.
Yes. Her mother basically had a baby every other year. And it wasn't just a new baby in a new town. It was a new con. He would start whatever the next con was. So Victoria is growing up in these, very, very obviously unstable, chaotic circumstances.
So any schooling?
No, almost no schooling at all. She had about 3 years of formal education. And when I say formal, I mean, let's not get our hopes up, right? We're talking about a one-room schoolhouse with a primer, really, really basic. And she only had about 3 years of that basic education. She and her family all learned to survive on their intelligence. They were clearly all intelligent, on charm and on hustling. Right. Her mother was a devout spiritualist, and this belief in spiritualism started to shape the family very quickly.
I mean, this is a period after the Second Great Awakening. America is a highly religious society, but spiritualism is a next step, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of a splinter movement. It's certainly not formal Christianity, right? So the idea of spiritualism is kind of blend of Christianity and mysticism. And basically it was all the variants of like seances, clairvoyance, mediums. It was all about speaking to the dead or being able to read people's minds, all of that kind of paranormal, supernatural stuff that we associate with mysticism.
And it's a world spiritualism in the 19th and into the 20th century in Britain, Europe, and America. in which women are deemed to be in some way specially skilled to operate in this world of mysticism and spiritualism.
Indeed. And a lot of historians have argued, I think very persuasively, that one of the reasons for the popularity of spiritualism was because it gave women a voice, because women could have authority. It was a route to power, because they weren't allowed to speak in their own voices, but they were literally allowed to speak as mediums for the voices of the dead or, whoever it might be that they said they were channeling. Victoria Woodhull herself said that Demosthenes was one of the people that she channeled, right? Now, we don't have to necessarily believe that a 3rd century Greek orator was actually speaking through Victoria Woodhull, but it gives you an indication of how you could literally invoke the authority of, a long dead Greek, for example, and then say, I've got advice. So it's not coming from Victoria Woodhull, it's coming from Demosthenes.
It's a way of having status, but it's also a way of making some money.
Absolutely. So it's a business, it's a religion, and it's a performance, right? It's very theatrical. And so these are all skills that Victoria is learning as she's growing up.
So she's doing this as a child?
As a child from the age of 10. They're on the circuit and her father puts her out there and she's, claiming to be a clairvoyant. And it was faith healing, right? So it was also the laying of hands that you said that, because of course this is pre-professionalized medicine. Obviously there's still rampant disease. A lot of medical understanding is rudimentary. And so you have a child. So, and again, it's part of the Second Great Awakening, the religiosity of it, the laying of hands as the way to heal.
I associate this period of American history with spiritualism, but also with patent medicines and snake oil. I mean, literal snake oil salesmen.
Literal snake oil.
This is a period where people are in tents offering salvation or offering cures.
Or both at the same time, exactly. And that was the world that Victoria grew up in. Now, it's important to note, because we're obviously being quite skeptical in our approach here, but it's an open question how much exactly Victoria Woodhull believed. She certainly had some commitment to a sense of spiritualism. She certainly experienced trance states or talked about experiencing trance states. I think also some of it was a conscious performance. She's laying it on thick sometimes, but I don't think it's quite the case that she was simply a con artist and didn't believe it at all. But it's open to question how much she herself believed it. I don't think her father believed it.
What's unquestioned, though, is that she is learning from a very, very young age performance. Yeah. She's learning persuasion. She is learning theatrics. She is gathering the sort of skills that rich kids are gaining from doing debating classes at universities and colleges.
Exactly. This is her classroom, but she's growing up in a traveling medicine show in carnivals, and as you say, selling patent medicines and all of that.
Yeah, you're not going to come out of that an introvert.
No, you're going to come out with a very specific skill set. Yeah, so it kind of doesn't matter whether it was genuine, whether it was survival, how much of it was manipulation, how committed she was to spiritualism, because it shaped the way she saw herself, that she was a woman who was destined to speak, that she was destined to be powerful, that she was destined to kind of be listened to no matter who tried to silence her.
This is someone after that upbringing who is not going to be a wallflower. They're going to do something, aren't they?
And even as a child, she was the main breadwinner for her family from the age of 10 or 12 because she was good at it.
So the people coming to see her.
Absolutely. She was a draw.
There were grown-ups coming to see this child to say, I've lost my son, my husband, my wife. Please, can you communicate with them? And that's power. Exactly. In the hands of a child.
Exactly. It was clearly her first taste of power. And so we have to acknowledge that she had to be good at it in some way, that she was intuiting something, that she was connecting with the people around her, that she was convincing them, that she could persuade them, that she was talking to their dead relative. Well, you can't do that if you're not picking up on cues, if you're not highly astute.
You have to be sharp to do that.
You have to be really sharp, hearing their clues, picking up on them, learning how to tell them what they want to hear. All of that stuff that professional con artists do, she was doing with some mix of, yes, fraud, but also some mix of intuition. And she always said that there was inspiration in there, that it did come to her. Maybe it came to her through intelligence rather than through the spirit world, but we won't know.
I've seen kids in developing countries on the street hustling tourists, and they've been some of the brightest kids I've ever seen. And I kind of think, Goldman Sachs should be recruiting those kids, because to survive on the streets and be able to convince adults with your persuasion, with your personality, when you are a child, that's an incredible skill.
I think you're right that the mere survival itself demonstrates how shrewd they have to be. That's the proof of it, right?
But this is the middle of the 19th century, and she's a girl.
And a child. So she's a young girl. Her story's just getting started. When she was barely 15 years old, she had just turned 15, in 1853, she married. She married a man named Dr. Canning Woodhull, who convinced her that he was an eminent doctor, that he came from an elite family in New York. Unfortunately for Victoria, almost all of that was completely untrue. She had, in fact, fallen for a con artist, and he was not really a doctor. He was mostly an alcoholic.
And she was 15. Is that normal to get married at 15, 1853?
Well, it wasn't unheard of, especially in the kinds of communities that she was coming from in rural or working class areas. Obviously, economic necessity, or even just local norms, cultural practices could push girls into early marriages, but it wasn't exactly common either. The average age for marrying for the first time at that point in that area was around 22, 23.
So it is really early.
So it's definitely young, but it wasn't unheard of. It's not the shock that it would be today for somebody that young to marry.
Well, it's illegal today.
Well, it would be illegal. Well, I mean, people still do it, but I'm afraid in America that's still going on.
So that was my naivety there. I think
that's another story.
Yeah, I saw you remembered Elvis there.
Yeah, exactly. Jerry Lee Lewis. The list can go on and on. And she was his cousin, so we can just keep going. Yeah, that's another episode. Yeah. We'll talk about pedophiles later.
America's child brides. Yeah.
What a depressing thought. It will not surprise you to hear, David, that this marriage did not turn out well. As I said, Woodhull was a chronic alcoholic, but he also slept around from the very beginning. He was sleeping with prostitutes, which was obviously very unsafe behavior in an age of rampant STDs. He later developed at some point, we don't know exactly when, but by the end of his life, he had an opium addiction.
The whole suite. Alcoholism, prostitutes, you may as well do the whole
for
thing.
Opium, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Go for broke. So yeah, she was dealing with a lot. And let's remember, she's a teenager. And they had 2 children. He left her on her own, basically, to support herself, their kids, while he went off on drinking binges. And of course, he was racking up debts as well that she also had to deal with. Now, their son was their eldest child. He was born with severe mental disabilities. And of course, it's the mid-19th century. The medical understanding of what was wrong with him was rudimentary at best. Whatever his condition was very severe. And Victoria always blamed it on Canning's alcoholism. I think she was probably right. The symptoms that come through are certainly consistent with fetal alcohol syndrome. And so it may well be that, we're talking about the rudimentary understanding of medicine and science, but she understood enough to make the connection and to see that her husband's chronic drunkenness may well have had something to do with her son's severe disabilities. All of this makes clear the extent to which her first marriage was a crash course in why Victorian marriage laws were so hard on women. They were a prison for women in unhappy marriages. And that was a lesson that Victoria was going to carry with her.
And an economic trap.
It was a trap of every kind, right? An economic trap. It was a sexual trap. The exchange was supposed to be you give up your rights and he'll protect you. And if you give up your rights to somebody who not only doesn't protect you, but betrays you at every turn, you have no recourse.
And for most women who enter bad marriages, it is a trap from which there is no escape.
It is a lifetime prison sentence because divorce was nearly impossible for women at this time. But in 1864, Victoria somehow managed to secure one. She legally freed herself from Woodhull. We don't really know how she did it, but it certainly suggests her determination because that was really rare.
So she's got out of that terrible marriage. She's still very young, but she has children.
2 children. And she goes back to her eccentric family who are still on the faith healing circuit because it turns out that Victoria wasn't the only one in the family with a spiritualist talent. Her younger sister also was very good at this.
And which state is the younger sister named after?
The younger sister is named after Tennessee.
Right.
She then renamed herself, it's a visual joke, but she renamed herself Tennie, Tennie, middle initial C, Tennie, C. I don't know why it amuses me, but it does.
I'm dyslexic, so I'm struggling with it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Spelling jokes are not my strong suit.
Okay, I'll spare you the spelling jokes. But for our listeners who like a spelling joke, they might all say it's a bad joke anyway. So her sister inherited the family talent for spiritualism, and Victoria came and rejoined the family, and then the 2 of them become this sister act. And they travel around together as mediums, faith healers. They called themselves medical clairvoyants.
Medical clairvoyance.
and said they could diagnose and cure illnesses, including cancer, through spirit guidance.
So it's not just talk to your dead relatives. We can save you. We can cure you.
We can save you. And they got into trouble because she claimed to save somebody from cancer who she didn't save from cancer. And so they ended up with lawsuits. And so they were constantly on the run. But it also helped the growing family business that both Victoria and her sister were extremely attractive. There are lots of photographs of both of them. Her sister was flat out beautiful. She would still be considered beautiful today, in my reckoning anyway. Victoria was less conventionally pretty, but she's an extremely striking woman. I actually think she looks a lot like Cate Blanchett in some photos of her. She had dark hair and blue eyes. And there was a later newspaper article that described her and I think gives a nice picture of how she struck people anyway. It said she had a fascinating voice, low, soft, and persuasive, and her gentle and pretty blue-gray eyes beam into yours with an earnest and tender light. I think it's fair to say she was winning over the reporter here. I'm assuming it's a he, goes on to say, she's of medium height, smiles sweetly, showing pretty white teeth between tempting lips. Her face is a little angular, but what she lacks in doll baby beauty, she more than overbalances in impressive manner and natural simplicity that adds to her attractions.
He's basically in love with this guy.
Right. And this is how...
Get a room.
She was very alluring and she had this appeal. She's clearly very sexually alluring. And that, as we will see, becomes very central to her story.
This is a woman skilled at spiritualism. And this is the 1860s. America is going through the greatest rupture in its history, which is going to leave America desperate for the sort of skills that she and her sister have, the skills of the spiritualist medium.
That's exactly right. The country's being torn apart by the Civil War. And it's also, obviously, a conflict over the questions of freedom and equality and what that means for all Americans. And Victoria Woodhull is one of the millions of Americans who emerges from the Civil War convinced that the country needs to do better.
Okay, let's take a break there and then let's come back and tell the story of how in that period after the Civil War, that period called Reconstruction, Victoria transforms her life, but how she also makes an absolute fortune. Welcome back to Journey Through Time. So, Sarah, America's gone through the unbelievable trauma of the Civil War. What's happening to Victoria?
Well, in the midst of the war, she actually met someone. She met a man named Colonel James Blood, who was a Civil War colonel from Missouri, but he was a fellow spiritualist. He was also a radical reformer, and he came to consult her because at this point she had hung out her shingle as a spiritualistic physician. So before the break, she was a medical clairvoyant. Now she's a spiritualistic physician, and Colonel Blood came to consult with her.
Had you been injured in the war, do we know?
We don't know. I don't think he had been seriously injured if he was. I don't know what his ailment was.
And I'm presuming he's a colonel in the Union Army.
I'm happy to report he's a Union colonel, so he's
on the
yeah, exactly. He's on the right side of the war, the right side of history. Victoria and Colonel Blood were attracted to each other from the start. She actually said that during their first meeting, she told him that a medium in the moment informed her that basically, she clairvoyantly discovered as they were together that he was going to marry her.
The professional standards of being a spiritualist physician allow you to flirt with patients, evidently.
And married patients. He was married with 2 kids. And she said, my medium says you're going to marry me. And it worked as a pickup line. It appears to have been successful. They were clearly attracted to each other from the start. And this is Victoria embellishing her story later. So who knows whether she actually said anything like that in their first meeting. Also, she was very attractive, as we said earlier, and so was he. Again, he's somebody who's photographed. He's a handsome man. He has the very full whiskers that were fashionable at the time. I always think he looks like a kind of unkempt hipster.
Yeah, he looks like he'd be a barista now,
exactly.
Making a cappuccino art.
He would have neatly tied up his whiskers if he were today, because he's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, but the photography of this period, it's quite remarkable. Ambrotypes and daguerreotypes, those early photographic processes with very narrow depth of fields. I saw the photographs of him. He looks very intense.
Very intense. But there are some pictures where he's staring straight at the camera and his eyes appear very soulful as well. But certainly his expression is intense. And it's remarkable, I think, to your point about Victorian photographs. We're all familiar with people looking so stiff, and they often just look so unappealing and unattractive because of the constraints of early photography. But both Woodhull and Blood come across across as very, very attractive, which makes me think they must have been exceedingly attractive. Most people in Victorian photographs do not look as attractive as these two do to modernize.
Most people look like they're what it is. They've stood there for 10 minutes with a clamp around their neck and they're looking forward to getting home and having a cup of tea.
They look pissed off, but not necessarily attractive by contemporary standards. So it may sound as if it doesn't matter whether they're attractive or not, but this is a story about sexual attraction. Sexual attraction is going to drive a lot of this story. So I think it's interesting to recognize them as people who I think, even today people would see their attractiveness.
So we're allowed in this story to look at these photographs and work out whether we fancy them or not. It's okay.
I mean, I'm giving us permission.
Okay. All right.
I mean, let's be honest, we all do it anyway, but in this case, it's historically necessary, David.
Professionally, it's something we're required to do. Okay.
And yes, my answer is that Well, I would need him to trim his beard, let's be honest. But as I said, he was married with children at the time, which is awkward, but he was clearly very drawn to her spiritual side. And very quickly, possibly on the spot, their connection became more than spiritual. It became quite earthly, I think. But having made that joke, they did have this profound spiritual connection as well. They both believed in spiritualism, as we said, and Blood was known for his progressive politics. Now, this might sound like surprising for, an army officer, not necessarily somebody we would associate with radical agenda, but he supported women's rights, he supported utopian socialism, and he believed in spiritualism, as we're saying. But he also, very much unlike Victoria's first husband, encouraged her ambition. He recognized her ability, he recognized her potential, and he introduced her to his world of radical politics.
This is a million miles from her first marriage.
This was a marriage of equals. This was a true partnership in a modern sense, in a way that we would recognize. And it was a marriage based on mutual attraction. It was based on mutual goals. It was a full partnership in every sense.
I mean, her life's barely begun, and yet she's already transformed her fortunes. She came from utter poverty. She was literally a child bride to an alcoholic. And now she's in a love match with somebody who believes in her.
Who's her intellectual equal, who she is sexually attracted to. Their relationship, though, was also unconventional from the start. Now, that seems to have worked for both of them, at least for a long time. But there's some indication that their marriage might even have included mutual sexual freedom from the beginning.
Like an open marriage.
Well, whether they both signed...
Is that too a 60s phrase to use for the 1860s?
And the question is whether they both signed up for it, because it seems clear that they both acted upon principles of mutual sexual freedom. Did they actually agree to an open marriage? I don't know. Clearly, they were both also sexually active outside the marriage. There's a lot of evidence of that.
Key to an open marriage is both parties agree.
Well, exactly.
Else it's adultery.
And that, exactly. So, but they had mutual adultery. Whether they were both happy about it, the record does not show. But basically, they very quickly became a power couple on this radical reform spiritualist circuit. And they were really pushing the boundaries of Victorian respectability at the time.
And this is a period after the Civil War, almost 1 million killed in the Civil War, in which people who would never have even considered spiritualism or going to a spiritualist medium, more middle-class people, even upper-class people, because of the trauma, because of the loss, because of the deaths of husbands, sons, brothers, are open to the idea of spiritualism. So it is a boom time to be a spiritualist.
Exactly. And you see spiritualism kind of working its way up the social hierarchy, up the ladder of respectability, because people are desperate and they will cling to anything. And remember that we're still in an age of great religiosity. And so if kind of traditional Christian messages, are not enough consolation, then you might seek something more direct, like trying to speak to a lost loved one. It's also worth saying that historians have pointed out, I think this is really interesting, that in an age where telegraphy had just been invented, you suddenly have telegraphs which can send invisible messages across the ether, apparently.
Almost magically.
And suddenly people can receive them. It's not really that much of a stretch to then start to imagine people receiving messages clairvoyantly. You start to think about telekinesis. You start to think about the idea of invisible movement of messages, invisible transmission. It's a really interesting idea, isn't it?
That's so fascinating.
I mean, I can't take credit for it, as I say. It's other historians who've pointed this out, but I think it's a really, really smart idea. And it suggests the ways in which other cultural factors can help influence those kinds of trends. Why would you suddenly believe in spiritualism? Well, if telegraphs, well, why not? Who says it's not possible, right?
And we were saying earlier about it becoming more popular, more acceptable, more respectable. Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of President Lincoln, holds seances in the White House. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest at least one of those seances Lincoln went to, that the president fighting the war is engaged in this world of spiritualism because, of course, Lincoln loses children.
Yeah, they lost a lot of children, right? So it's desperation, and you can understand the drive for any kind of consolation. And if you're in an era where faith is already so embedded in your worldview, then it's not that much of a stretch. One of the people who quite famously was starting to believe in spiritualism was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon. I think the name Vanderbilt is still a household name in America, but maybe less so in Britain.
I think it's one of those names that if you know it, you associate it with that period, but with other millionaires like Rockefeller, like JP Morgan. I think that idea that there are these titans, these multimillionaires, I think it has that sort of ring to it.
Yeah, and that's exactly who these guys are, right? These are the original robber barons, the tycoons, the titans of industry, as you say, each of them cornering their different markets. So famously, Rockefeller has Standard Oil, JP Morgan is high finance, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, he was a railroad tycoon, but he was also a grieving widower, another grieving man. And he also had lost a son and his mother, and he was obsessed with contacting them, not only because he was grieving for them, but also because he believed that they could guide him. Of course, if you believe in spiritualism, you also believe that people have moved on to a greater dimension. So your loved ones are supposed to get greater wisdom through death. So they can maybe start giving you like stock tips and stuff, is basically how the logic starts to develop. They go, well, you know everything now. You're in eternity. You must be able to see you're omniscient.
So it's not just about recovering relationships with lost relatives. It's about drawing knowledge and wisdom. Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's advice. Vanderbilt was phenomenally wealthy and extremely famous. He's really the Jeff Bezos of his time. And I don't think that that's a cheap analogy. I think it works really well. His wealth was equivalent to many billions. He was one of the richest men in American history. When he died in 1877, his fortune was estimated at around $100 million, which is literally tens of billions of dollars today.
And it's a fortune from the railways.
Yeah.
The railway industry is the key to this expanding economy at a time when America is becoming a nation with higher wages than Europe, when America is becoming more industrialized than most European nations.
That's exactly right. And Vanderbilt, well, the reason I compare him to Bezos is that he was also someone who transformed his own industry, for good or ill, depending on your point of view, but his transformative effect is undeniable. He reshaped the American economy. He really did. And so, of course, he was extremely famous as well as being extremely wealthy. By what is perhaps a coincidence, but probably not, 3 years after the end of the Civil War, Victoria Woodhull, her new husband, James Blood, and her sister, the one that she used to be on the spiritualist circuit with, Tennessee, they arrive in New York City with some money that they've made. They've been successful as spiritualists, but they're not rich. And they have a plan.
So this sounds like a hustle.
I think it's a hustle. But their plan is to meet Vanderbilt, who is well known for his spiritualist beliefs.
This sounds like that scene in a heist movie when they're getting together to describe what they're going to do.
Exactly. And you're going to go for Vanderbilt, right? So imagine a scenario today in which Jeff Bezos was well known for believing in, faith healing or something. Of course, faith healers would be flocking to him to try to sell him. But Vanderbilt was a tough nut to crack, right? He was brutal in all kinds of ways. He was
infamously brutal.
Infamously brutal. This was not a man who was going to be, a pushover. And he was obviously extremely intelligent. He's not somebody that you're just going to come in and win over quickly. But they got to him. They got to him fast. And he became very close to both sisters very quickly. They became his spiritual advisors.
Did they just knock on his door?
Apparently, yeah. There are different accounts of it. Some say that it was her father, actually, Victoria's father, the one-eyed con artist who managed to finagle the introduction. But most of the sources I've seen just say that, that it was more like a cold call. They just rocked up and said, "We are these successful spiritualist sisters."
So and this woman from poverty in Ohio knocks on the door of the mansion of the richest man in America. The Fifth Avenue mansion.
Presents her card. I'm speculating. I don't know that that's the case, but you can picture it, right? Presents her calling card, Victoria C. Woodhull, spiritualist to the stars or something. And then Vanderbilt says, "Okay, I'll see them."
That's quite a pitch.
And who does he see? He sees two extremely attractive young women coming and telling him that they will be his spiritualist advisors. We were saying that their attractiveness is a key part of their story. And this is one of those moments where it matters because Vanderbilt almost certainly starts having an affair with the younger sister. Well, I don't even know if I would call it an affair. It's transactional. I think they were friends. They're sleeping together.
Friends with benefits.
Friends with benefits. He's providing all of the obvious benefits he can provide, which is not just cold hard cash, but also advice. And she was providing him with creature comforts, shall we say. But Victoria was also told him anyway that she was channeling stock tips from the afterlife in the way that we were talking about.
So she's advising the richest man in America how to invest his money by talking to the dead.
Exactly.
That's quite a business model.
Seemed to make them all happy, and it made them rich for a while. It started to work.
It worked.
Well, the question is, of course, is who was giving stock tips to whom, right? This is a story that Victoria Woodhull is telling later and that other people around her are telling. But are the stock tips really coming from Victoria? What I would imagine is that we're back in the scenario that we were talking about when she was a child, when she is like a psychic today. No offense to psychics who may be listening, but...
I'm quite happy to offend psychics.
But, my assumption about psychics is that they are listening to clues and telling people what they want to hear.
They feed back to people things that they've given away that they want to hear.
And I assume that Victoria was doing something like that with Vanderbilt.
But enough to convince him that her advice is the key to even greater riches.
Apparently. But he was also definitely giving them stock tips, I think. And was that pillow talk? Was it sitting in the drawing room and saying, here's my advice, young ladies, this is what I think you should do, is unclear. But he gives them the advice and they start to follow his advice and they start to make some money on Wall Street. We were talking before about the fact that one of the reactions to the Civil War was this boom in spiritualism, but it was also a boom in speculation, in economic speculation. There was, in fact, a speculative frenzy. For all kinds of reasons, there was an enormous amount of energy in American investment at this time, and it was very unstable, but people were making a lot of money in a short space of time. And by 1870, so 2 years after meeting Vanderbilt, the two sisters had reportedly amassed somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000, which would be many millions of dollars today.
Now, if their story ended there, two women from rural Ohio who'd befriended the richest man in America and was giving him stock tips by speaking to the dead, that would still be a great Journey Through Time episode.
It's already a good
what
story.
A story. Yeah, I mean, that's enough. I'm sold. But we're not even halfway through her story.
She's just getting started. This is just the beginning. Victoria is such an interesting person because she is herself clearly, and we'll see this throughout her story, for good or ill, which may be a phrase we end up repeating more than once. She is somebody who is very alert to the ideas of her time and very engaged with the ideas of her time. And this is a moment when, in the United States, the women's rights movement is in turmoil. Now, this is a complicated story that we don't really have time to get into all the details of, but I'm sure we will be coming back to this story again and again and again. It's so important, so formative, and it is really complex. But for the purposes of understanding Victoria Woodhull, what we need to understand at this moment is that there are famous American feminist activists like Susan B. Anthony, who is, for our British listeners, Susan B. Anthony is America's Mrs. Pankhurst. This is Sylvia Pankhurst. Just think her and you basically got it. Susan B. Anthony is so famous in America that she was on the silver dollar, right? She's a national figure. And then there's another woman slightly lesser known today called Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they're the kind of mothers of American feminism. Now, they were battling over a series of constitutional changes that had come out of the Civil War. And these changes have been unbelievably consequential for United States history to the extent that debates about them have reopened in American politics today, which again is a story for another time. But what I'm talking about specifically are the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They're sometimes called the Civil War Amendments. They were amendments that were passed immediately after the war to establish the rights that the war had been fought over.
Because those rights weren't being naturally given in the southern defeated Confederate states.
Exactly, or indeed in the North as well. So what they were doing was granting voting rights specifically, but also wider citizenship rights to people that had historically been denied those citizenship rights in the United States, namely African Americans. Now, specifically, however, what happened was that the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendments granted rights to Black men, but they explicitly excluded women.
And explicitly is the key here.
Explicitly excluded women.
It's putting gender language in the Constitution in a way it hadn't been previously.
For the first time. And that was the result of horse trading in Congress over exactly this question. Are you going to give actual universal rights? Well, they weren't prepared to do that. They were prepared under duress. Some people believed in full racial rights and still believed that women were second-class citizens. Some people believed in the reverse. And there was one segment of the population that believed in equal rights for all. But those people were not dominating the legislative debates over the amendments to the Constitution. And so the compromise ended up being that Black men would get rights, but not women.
Another of those difficult compromises in American history.
There are a lot of them.
There are a lot of them.
And they've been enormously consequential. So one of the results of this very conflicted, complicated, compromised decision was that the suffrage movement then ends up in a very tense relationship with the Black civil rights movement, partly because some of these women were themselves white supremacists. So they didn't welcome Black rights. And furthermore, they were angry about the fact that they had been excluded. So there were also women who felt that they had thrown their support behind the anti-slavery abolition movement. They had thrown their support behind Black people, and then Black men were not supporting them. And so you get into these camps. And as if that weren't complicated enough, then the women's suffrage movement itself divides into a camp actually over this question effectively. There are these factions, there are infighting, all of the stuff that often happens on the left in progressive movements. There are all of these battles over whose agenda is going to lead the movement. But what it meant was that there was an opening for new voices, for new figures. And in 1869, as these two suffrage camps are fighting out what they think should be happening for women to get the vote, Victoria Woodhull steps into the fight.
And she has her own money.
She has a lot of money that she's made with the help of Cornelius Vanderbilt.
And all of the skills of an orator, all of the skills as a performer that she's gathered from being a spiritualist from the age of 10. She
quickly made an impression on these groups. She was, yes, I'm going to make a bad pun here, a magnetic public speaker. You know, like that. She believed in magnetic healing and she could get the audiences. But one of the fights that was dividing the suffrage movement at the time was over whether women should only be fighting for the vote or whether they should be fighting for a wider array of rights. And Victoria Woodhull had a very clear position on this. She was not interested in only getting the vote. She wanted a social revolution. She wanted an economic, political, sexual, and spiritual revolution for women. It's very clear that this drive for transformation was really shaped by her first marriage, by her experience of a total loss of rights, a total loss of power in her first marriage in what was effectively an abusive relationship. But also, as a spiritualist, she said this over and over again, she was listening to these people who were suffering, these people who were immensely unhappy, women and men, who would come to her. And she saw thousands of people, she said, as she was traveling around the country as a young woman with her sister. Thousands of people would come to her for help. And she said the one thing that was making the most people the most miserable was unhappy marriages. And she became absolutely convinced that the key to social transformation was to have a total gender revolution, and particularly to liberate people from unhappy marriages, and particularly to liberate women. One of the ways in which she's completely ahead of her time is that she saw instantly that financial independence was the key. So the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement, is totally focused on the vote. But Victoria was focused on financial independence. She said suffrage is only one phase of the larger question of women's emancipation. More important is the question of her social and economic position. Her financial independence underlies all the rest.
Financial independence is more important, she's saying, than suffrage, which means the vote.
Which means the vote. And I think this is a very modern position, right? This is about recognizing structural inequalities, about recognizing that the vote will only take you so far if you don't have the kinds of basic power that you need to exercise full political agency. What does that mean if you don't actually have financial agency, if you don't actually have physical security, autonomy, et cetera? So she's very, very clear about that.
And she's not just saying it. She's not just being clear about it. She's living it.
She decided that being a spiritualist to the stars, making Cornelius Vanderbilt happy, making her own personal fortune, that wasn't enough. Victoria had bigger projects. with the backing of Cornelius Vanderbilt, but also using the money that they had made, Victoria and her sister had acquired the capital to do what was really unthinkable at the time in 1870, open their own brokerage on Wall Street.
They're going to become stockbrokers.
As women. Two
on
women,
Wall Street.
Sisters. They're going to open a brokerage. Never been done before.
What financial rights do women have independent from the husbands at this point?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because at the time, you're absolutely right. Women did not independently hold their own money. And so Victoria's money would have legally been controlled by her husband, Colonel Blood. I don't actually know the answer to whether he gave her the right over her own money. I would imagine, given his politics, that he probably did. But she obviously wasn't concerned about it because they had this very equal partnership. But yeah, he could have taken the money and run legally, is the case. But he was obviously supporting them. In fact, he helped manage the brokerage. And in early 1870, a brokerage called Woodhull, Claflin and Company opened at 44 Broad Street, and it made Victoria and her sister Tennessee the first women to own and operate a brokerage on Wall Street.
What was the reaction to two women?
The reaction was mayhem. They went absolutely crazy. The papers were reporting it all over the place. The New York Sun ran a headline, "Petticoats among the bovine and ursine animals." That is the bulls and bears of Wall Street. And of course, that treats them as a curiosity, as a novelty, but it also suggests the ways in which they might be a threat to the order, right? This is going to throw everything off. And how are all of that stuff about how are the men going to focus on work if there are petticoats there distracting them? They were called the bewitching brokers, so a nice bit of patronizing sexism for them. And literally crowds would gather to gawk at them. They would come and just press their noses against the window and try to see these beautiful, elegantly dressed young women as they were, striding into work and starting to make trades.
I mean, good publicity.
Very good publicity, except that it was as novelties, right? So Wall Street sees them as, it's a curiosity, it's a joke.
One of the newspapers calls it an experiment.
It's an experiment, but they're willing to tolerate this experiment because they're attractive, it's fun, and this is all amusing. But Victoria saw it as something much more than an amusing game.
She's trying to prove her principles. Women need to be financially independent if they're going to have any real form of independence. So this is putting principles into practice.
Absolutely. It's putting her money where her mouth is, literally and figuratively. And that's exactly what her intention was. She was very clear about it. And for a few years, they did very well, their brokerage. They were speculating successfully in this volatile, speculative market that we were talking about earlier. But yeah, she was there to prove that women could control wealth, that women could master capitalism, that they could be just as powerful as the captains of high finance, but also that they could fund their own political future. And that's the next step for her. In other words, a brokerage wasn't enough either. She had even bigger ambitions.
And what was the next stage in the Victoria Woodhull master plan?
Just a little bit later in 1870, not long after opening her brokerage, kind of out of the blue, Victoria Woodhull announced in the pages of the New York Herald that she was running for the office of President of the United States.
That's the next step in the master plan.
She just sends a letter to the Herald and says, she wrote a column and said, I'm announcing my candidacy for president.
Out of the blue?
Pretty much out of the blue. I mean, certainly publicly out of the blue, right? And let's remember, this is a woman with almost no formal education, 3 years of schooling in the wilds of the Ohio Valley at the time. And she staked her claim to the highest office in the land firmly on the ground of her own achievements. This is what she said in the Herald, where she announces her ambition to run for president. While others of my sex devoted themselves to a crusade against the laws that shackle the women of the country, I asserted my individual independence. While others prayed for the good time coming, I worked for it. While others argued the equality of women with man, I proved it by successfully engaging in business. While others sought to show that there was no valid reason why women should be treated socially and politically as being inferior to man, I boldly entered the arena of business and exercised the rights I already possessed. I therefore claimed the right to speak for the enfranchised women of the country. I now announce myself as candidate for the presidency.
And this is in 1870, and this is with no political backing? I mean, this is an age of two parties.
Yeah. No political party, no grassroots campaign, no fundraising, just the money that she herself has earned. And she's just 31 years old. which for those of us who know our Constitution
Is a bit of a problem.
is a bit of a problem. It means she's ineligible. And the president has to be 35 or older according to the Constitution.
We haven't had the problem with older for a while.
No, that hasn't been the issue lately.
So there's a minimum age, but sadly not a maximum.
Yeah. But the fact is that mere bagatelles like constitutional barriers are not going to stop Victoria Woodhull. It's important to say 1870 is not yet an election year. So she's throwing her hat into the ring ahead of time. So she's going to spend the next 2 years working to acquire all of that infrastructure, to get a platform, to get a party, to get a nomination. For a while, she tried to create her own new political party. And I love this. It's actually one of my favorite details in the whole story. She called her party at the beginning the Cosmopolitical Party. I completely want to bring back the Cosmopolitical Party. And that is a party I would join. Honestly, I would just be like, sign me up for the Cosmopolitical Party. Right? I mean, it just sounds like US politics with a cocktail, doesn't it?
It sounds like a sort of 60s band.
It's true. It does. Psychedelic.
Yeah, I can imagine them supporting Sly and the Family Stone.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. Well, I see, for me, it's more like straight out of Sex and the City, where I just see them like with a Cosmo and then Cosmo in one hand and president, actually the president, with the feet up on the Resolute desk in high heels holding a Cosmo, right? That's kind of what I picture. I'm all for reviving it. And then, wait for it, because Victoria didn't have enough going on, she handed the reins of the stock brokerage to her husband, and she decided that she was going to become a publisher. Once again, breaking glass ceilings, breaking new ground. And in becoming a publisher, she once again became one of the first women in America to do so.
So she's going to start a newspaper.
She's going to start a newspaper.
While running for president.
Well, having your own social media channel when you are a politician is, as politicians today well know, a useful thing to have. And it's another way in which Victoria Woodhull is ahead of her time. She can see that if she wants to achieve her political ambitions, and if she wants to achieve her radical reform project more broadly, then a newspaper is going to be a really useful thing to have.
And because of who she is, she just opens one.
She just starts her own. She's not going to mess around trying to join somebody else's. She's the epitome of be the change you want to see in the world, right? Victoria wants a newspaper. She's just going to start one. It's
been an astonishing rise. She's gone from poverty in rural Ohio, unhappy marriage, child bride. She now is the first female stockbroker on Wall Street. She's running for president and she's about to open a newspaper. It is an astonishing transformation, but the story's not over. And the second half of the story is equally amazing, but it's also tragic in lots of ways and a lot more troubling.
So join us next time as Victoria Woodhull takes her fight to the national stage. See you next time.
And thank you for listening.